The thesis of this video is indeed a divisive and topical one. It is that of the following. Gender is not an innate biological truth, but rather a social construct, created and reinforced through cultural norms, social expectations and practices, and does not follow a binary structure, as is suggested by the hegemonic belief imposed upon us from our earliest interactions with society and hegemonic power structures. Furthermore, sex, as in the biological classification of male and female, does not exist in a binary structure, but rather exists on a spectrum. In this video, I will attempt, and probably fail, to make the argument and convince you, being the people still entrenched within hegemonic belief and value systems, that there is a need to abolish gender as a social construct altogether, that it is at best useless and at worst actively harmful. Simone de Beauvoir's seminal work, The Second Sex, is largely the foundation on which we as leftists and feminists conceptualise and understand quote-unquote gender, as well as massively influencing the broader academic community and the greater public. Simone de Beauvoir argued that gender was not an innate characteristic of an individual's biology, but rather a social construction that was superimposed upon individuals within a society, often, yet not always, as some cultures have developed third genders, not based upon sex, but rather other cultural, social, spiritual, and so on reasonings, based on the biological quote-unquote sex. She famously declared, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." This statement encapsulates Simone de Beauvoir's view that gender is not an innate biological characteristic, like genitalia or chromosomes, as conservatives would like us to believe, but rather a social construct that is imposed upon individuals based upon their biological sex, by society and culture, not by you. Your gender is taught and enforced upon you from young onwards. Beauvoir believed that gender is a direct product of societal and cultural norms, enforced by and creating itself metaphysical structures that influence how we as individuals within a greater collective of society behave, rather than being the result of biological determinism, which is based upon a vague and simplistic categories of gender that cannot possibly accurately reflect the expansive complexity and diversity of human life, existence, experience, however you wish to phrase it. It just cannot. Yet we use these categories to define ourselves, others, our social expectations, and our cultural institutions. She argued that our societal structures assign social roles and expectations solely on the basis of biological sex, and this process of thrusting onto people social norms, expectations, and roles within society begins from birth, arguably even beforehand. Girls are socialised to embody the archetype of femininity, to be, in the way largely Western hegemons view, emotional and nurturing, whilst on the other hand, boys are socialised to embody the archetype of masculinity, to be strong and competitive. These inherently gendered expectations baked within our societies create metaphysical constraints in the process, to some extent shaping individuals' identities, influencing their behaviour. I am going to go a little bit off topic here, but I find it insightful and interesting, so bear with me for a second. Not only that, but these gendered expectations also influence, to some extent, one's superego. The superego represents the internalized moral and ethical codes of societies. Zizek argues that it is structured around a fundamental antagonism or tension. In the case of what we are trying to explore within today's video, gender, this antagonism arises because of the impossibility to fully meet and conform to gendered expectations and norms. You will always fall short of the socially constructed ideal. This creates a feeling of guilt and anxiousness within people who fail to fully embody and perform their gender role. This leads them to strive even harder towards an objectively unattainable, abstracted notion of masculinity or femininity. Using this analysis, we can conclude that these gendered notions put in place by abstracted metaphysical structures, not only serve to constrain individuals' behaviour, but also to shape their innermost psychological structures on a broad, fundamental level. Now getting back on track with the video. Beauvoir's work has been incredibly influential in the development of a broad body of feminist theory, which explores the ideas of deconstructing gender as a social construct. Feminist theorists argue that gender is a social construct used to create and maintain gender roles and stereotypes. These gender roles and stereotypes were, and still to some extent are, used to justify the subordination of women within society, reinforcing a patriarchal societal structure, and justifying the historic and contemporary oppression of women. Feminist theorists argue that the deconstruction of gender is necessary to achieve, funnily enough, gender equality. Building on Simone de Beauvoir's conceptualization of gender as socially constructive, Judith Butler's ideas on gender performativity argue that gender is not an innate and fixed characteristic of individuals, but rather a performance, repeated and maintained via cultural practices and norms. Butler argued that gender is not something one has, but rather something they do. Butler argued that this repetitive performance of gender creates itself the illusion of a stable, concrete gender identity. And don't get me wrong, this gender identity, as understood by Butler, is an illusion, as in order to maintain itself it must be constantly performed and reperformed through hegemonic cultural norms and practices and social roles. This being said, it is important to recognise that, according to Butler, gender is something one cannot opt out of, as it is a pervasive element of social life, collectively assumed by society and its institutions. Therefore, we can understand gender as a social construct maintained and perpetuated via metaphysical structures. These structures are rarely examined, let alone questioned by society, being universally accepted and largely assumed. Furthermore, feminists and leftist theorists alike have argued that sex, as in the biological classification of male and female, is not a binary, as is the hegemonic belief. On the contrary, sex exists on a spectrum, challenging the traditional belief and theories pertaining to sex, which posits that individuals are either female or male based upon certain biological classifications, namely genitalia and chromosomes. Michel Foucault's body of work on sexuality was massively influential in the development of this prior thesis, and the thesis of this entire video. He made the argument that sexuality, though it may appear to be, is not a fixed and stable category, but a socially constructed one, shaped via social norms and practices. He conceived and understood sexuality as a site of power and control, which serves to regulate one's sexual behaviour, and on a deeper level shape how we, as individuals, understand ourselves and our sexual desires. Foucault's analysis of sexuality created the framework for which the argument that sex is, in fact, not a binary, but a spectrum was built upon. The argument asserts that we as individuals can and do have a broad range of biological characteristics that do not neatly fall under the categories of male and female. An example of this are intersex people, which are variations in the sex characteristics that do not fit into the typical male or female associated characteristics. Furthermore, these categories themselves of male and female are not fixed and stable, but rather historically and culturally contingent. Foucault argues that what is classified as quote-unquote normal and quote-unquote abnormal in terms of sex, sexual desires, practices and identities are not fixed and are shaped via historical and social processes of power. Accepting the prior arguments, it logically concludes that we, as a collective society, should seek to abolish gender altogether, meaning we should strive to create a society wherein individuals are not assigned specific gendered roles and stereotypes based upon biological characteristics and features, but rather create one wherein people are free to express themselves and their personal identity, free from fear of discrimination, judgment, or persecution. The abolition of gender within a societal framework will not by any means be an easy task. It requires a radical restructuring of society and a rejection of hegemonic gender roles, practices, and stereotypes which are deeply ingrained into our culture and presumed by societal structures, influencing how we perceive reality itself from when we were babies onwards to today, and therefore having a profound impact on us, shaping even our innermost psychological structures. Moreover, this shift to a gender abolitionary society will take a large periods of time, wherein cultural and social attitudes slowly yet surely shift towards a more inclusive and equitable ideal of society. This shift towards a gender abolitionary society will require a long time, sustained effort to dismantle harmful structures that perpetuate these harmful notions and replace them with new ones. A common argument against the abolition of gender as a social construct is the fear that there will be some kind of loss of identity, as individuals can often rely on their gender as a means of shaping their identity to understand themselves and their perceived place within society. However, while it is true gender has historically been a way to shape an individual's identity, though by no means the only or the most important, the idea that the abolition of gender will lead to some kind of erasure of one's identity is a misconception, purposely spread by bad faith actors. On the contrary, the abolitionary movement is one that wishes to challenge a rigid and strict binary structure of norms and stereotypes imposed upon individuals beyond their will, in the process restricting how people can express their identity and their roles within society. Our societies currently, due to pervasive metaphysical structures, promote repression of individuals' identities, as we are forced to neatly fit within gendered stereotypes, roles, and norms. Therefore, if gender is abolished, it will not lead to the loss of identity, but rather a liberation of identity, which was once seen as unacceptable, as it directly opposed the assumed hegemonic systems. This will lead to a more inclusive and equitable society for all. Furthermore, the abolition of gender does not by any means mean the erasure of biological differences between individuals. That would be silly, though that is what conservatives would lead you to believe about our argument is. In actuality, it means recognising that these differences exist on a spectrum and that they do not determine an individual's worth within our society or their gender identity. Gender is a social construct, and from the inception of the notion of gender has always meant this. The abolition of gender also requires a rejection of the traditional binary view of sexuality. Instead, we should recognise that individuals can have a wide range of sexual orientations and preferences that are not limited to the categories of heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. I would recommend Foucault's work on sexuality to gain a deeper insight into this topic in particular. In conclusion, the belief that gender is socially constructed and not in a binary structure is a key foundational concept in our understanding on these topics, especially in feminist and leftist modes of thinking. This belief contradicts and challenges the deliberate misconception which conflates gender with biological sex, but rather it is a social construct shaped through social norms and roles. Furthermore, The recognition that sex exists on a spectrum challenges the traditional binary view of sex and asserts that individuals can have a wide range of biological characteristics that do not neatly fit within these vague, simplistic categories of quote-unquote male and female. The abolition of gender is a radical and challenging task, but it is necessary to achieve gender equality and create a society wherein individuals are free and safe to express themselves and their identities without fear of judgment or discrimination. We should strive to create a society wherein gender roles and stereotypes do not exist, but rather individuals are free to express their identities without being constrained and influenced by gender norms and practices. Without gender existing as a pervasive social constraint, people will be, on the most fundamental level, more free, liberated in a way, in a capacity that we cannot fully imagine due to the pervasive nature of these constructs and constraints. We should, as I have done, draw upon the works of feminist and leftist thinkers, such as Simone de Beauvoir, Michel Foucault, and Judith Butler, to guide us in our pursuit of gender abolition. By challenging traditional views of gender and sexuality, we can create a more just and equitable society for all individuals. Thank you, I hope you enjoyed today's video. All citations will be in the description, and yeah, have a good day.